This evening is going to be fun. We have 2 more classes where we will get to explore some of the yogic symbolism and specific passages and such. But today evening, I'm going to try to not do that, and we are going to simply walk through the life of Christ as the Bible describes it. We are going to focus just on the 4 canonical Gospels from the New Testament. Just go through the story, and as you already have noticed, I have Navashan with me. The plan is to share it also through music, through Swamiji's oratorio. And this is particularly special. The oratorio came to Swami as he traveled through the Holy Land. This was in the 80s, and he chose to express that inspiration through music. And for those of you that don't know, we are going to be performing this as a concert. It is about 90 to 120 minutes of music with a lot of instrumental, solo pieces, choir pieces. We'll be performing that just in about 3 weeks from now. So you'll be able to enjoy that in person. Or, Tranya, would you mind closing the door? Thank you. And today we'll just have a random sampling of a few songs as we walk with Christ and try to tune into his life. So it's going to be a more fun evening of just storytelling and just tuning into the presence and the life of Christ through the lens of these 4 Gospels. As I mentioned last week, the objective of this study and discussion is not theological. It is more devotional and to tune into the spirit of what the Scripture has to offer for us. And especially today, I'm not going to get into any specific details of what is there in which gospel, but simply weave it all in as one story. For those of you that are familiar with the Bible, the 4 Gospels are the primary source of information on Jesus' life. And most often, I don't have my copy here with me today, but last week I was pointing out to how small these sections are in the whole Bible as a book. And even within these 4 Gospels, it's actually not a linear historical account. In fact, there are even inconsistencies between what the 4 disciples wrote and how these are shared. We are not going to bother about all of it today. And in fact, there are even questions about whether this was, in fact, originally written during that time or added later, depending on stylistic differences and such. That's not the objective of our discussion. We will just, as I said, weave it all in as just one story. And even the chronology of how things happened is not always clear, because each of the 4 accounts present things a certain way. And there could be one story here and one story there, but it's not always clear whether story 1 happened before story 2 or not. So we all, scholars apparently, just have done their research and they use their best judgment to see how things might have flowed. So before we move on, we'll start with the first piece from the oratorio, which most of you are familiar with. You're all welcome to sing along with us if you know the words. This is not a performance, but we are not set up for sing along. I don't have sheets of lyrics or other things for you, but if you know the words, please do sing along with us. Children of God, your time of trial has ended. See where the dawn irradiates the night. Soon all your tears will rise like dew to the sun. Sorrows will turn to joy, your griefs to delight. Children, rejoice, for lo, the kingdom of God comes in full splendor. It needs but your sight. It's hard to speak after these pieces of music. This is, it's hard to pick favorites in Swami's music, but every time I hear this song, it first of all puts you in the zone of just tuning into the oratorio. For those of us that are familiar with this the whole piece. Every time you hear the song, you know what's coming next. There's just this joy of expectancy as soon as this song comes. But even in a more deeper sense, this whole song sets the tone not just for the oratorio, but how we see Christ's life. You know, once Swami in a talk mentioned, I think he said, this is the greatest story ever told, speaking of the story of Christ and especially the New Testament and these Gospels. And Asha was not sure whether it was an expression of speech or did he literally mean it. And then she went to him afterwards and asked, did you really mean that? Is this the greatest story ever told? And then Swami looked at her with almost like this childlike wonder and said, don't you think so? You know, in a sense, you know, this song summarizes that feeling for all of us, just that inspiration and that wonder that the life of Christ brings into all our hearts in a particular way. You know, going back to the story now, going back to the chronology and what's exactly happening in the Bible, and really as if we are watching a movie, this whole Old Testament of the many, many prophets, Abraham, Moses, and all the different things, we didn't get to go into all the details last week, but we sort of got a feeling of what it is like. All of this is predicting the coming of the Messiah. So the Bible is all about prophets, men of God, who are carrying God's message. But now there is this great prophet who's about to come as a fulfillment of all these previous ones that came. Moses, in the Old Testament declares that there is going to be this messenger of God, this Messiah that's going to come after me. He doesn't say when, just like when Master says there are going to be hard times. We have no idea whether it's coming in 5 years or 500 years. So Moses just makes a declaration saying there is going to be this great Messiah, this great prophet, who's going to come after me. He's going to be like me. He's going to be amongst you. He's going to walk with you, and he's going to lead you all to God. And Jesus' coming is the fulfillment of the promise. And if you're very new to all of this, if you're not from the Judeo-Christian tradition, this is the point of disagreement between Judaism and Christianity, because the Christians believe that Jesus was this prophet that has been predicted through various prophets and various parts of the Old Testament. And Jesus' birth and his own life is the fulfillment of that promise, whereas the Jews do not believe that. Their interpretation of these verses and of the Messiah is different, and they don't think Jesus was the one. At least I'm talking about 2,000 years ago. And still, that is the basic foundation of their religious faith. So Jesus is coming, and now going back to the song, Everything, we'll also share New Tomorrow, which is a song that's familiar to all of you. Jesus' coming is the coming of hope. It's the coming of light. It's the coming of that messenger from God, that doorway to God himself, because it's the descent of Christ consciousness. Every week in the festival, we read these lines. I'm trying to remember from the a ray of hope. A prayer went up from earth and you responded. A ray of your light flashed down from infinity. How does it go? Does anyone remember? Anyway. Drawn to mankind, drawn to the earth for the salvation of mankind. So there is this descent of pure light, of Christ consciousness that is taking human form in response to the prayer of our own hearts. So the song and just the melody and the vibration of it, more than the words, it speaks to that. I think if we tune in, at least that's how I feel it. I don't think it's just a mental idea of really tuning into this idea of God descending in flesh. That's really what we are talking about with the life of Christ, of pure light, of that infinite Christ taking human form and then walking, and simply for one reason, which is the salvation of mankind, not for any agenda of his own. And that is a story that follows, and it is coming, following all of these predictions and all these different prophets that came in the Old Testament, all of them talking about what is about to come. Ultimately, finally, he has arrived. So that song really, really rings so beautiful in our ears when we hear it with that idea and with that inspiration that we can feel ourselves. Let's also do New Tomorrow, which I know many of you will know. Again, it's a similar song. These are pieces that open the oratorio in a way. They're speaking to, in a sense, historically, biblically, they're speaking to Israel at that time, what was happening, who Christ was, what's happening in terms of the story. But really, it is also speaking to the inner reality of how God comes into our own lives. When the dawn breaks and in the morning sends the sun high in the sky, who would hide from heaven's glory? Who would pass the challenge by? La 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 la. There's a morning for every nation when the sun's high in the sky. There's a time for every people to affirm their destiny. La 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 la. Even so, all of us together can create a better land. Leave the past, a new tomorrow waits for all who understand. There's a la 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 tomorrow waits for all who understand. Okay, now coming to the story, most of this all of you might know. I'm still going to share it. There's a beautiful novel that I read when I was in my teenage years. And this was about, this was not in English language, I think. This was about the storyteller in a village who shared the story of the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. In India, there's this tradition of storytelling. For some reason, that's just not how Bible is shared. I wish it always was. Of just how, for 7 days, you would just come over and over again. Every night, somebody would just share the story. They would act it out. There'll be music. There'll be all kinds of theatrics in how they tell the same story of the Ramayana or the Mahabharata. And then next night, they'll pick back up from where they left. It's a very common tradition in India, not just with these two scriptures. That's how generally religion is shared. And this person who is this main character in that story, who listens to the story over and over again, as the years pass, this person is inspired more and more to go listen. Actually, it is about the character who's telling the story, and there's a relationship between them. But also, he's so inspired. And then at one point in that novel, he shares how the stories whose ends we know are sometimes more inspiring than stories which are just thrillers, which you don't know what's going to happen next, or which character is going to die, or who's going to do what. In that sense, we have heard the story of Jesus perhaps in bits and pieces, in different ways, at many times in all our lives. It's not a story that's unfamiliar to at least those of you in the room. I'm assuming most of you that are watching this on Zoom. But still, I think there's a lot of power in just being able to live that over and over again, of just going through what really happened. Oh, and then he came here, he healed this blind man, or he gave the Sermon on the Mount, and then he was taken for crucifixion, whatever that was. Just to play that over and over again, quite apart from being repetitive, when it carries that true vibration of Scripture, when it carries that divine presence within, that story is impregnated with so much of that grace and power. It almost soaks in and marinates, and it becomes more and more inspiring and beautiful as you hear it over and over again, rather than sounding repetitive or over-familiar in that way. And I think, just as all the other Indian scriptures are, the life of Christ also has the same quality. For us to just listen to the same story again, nothing changes. Now we are going to come into Easter in the next 4 weeks. It's the same story that we hear each year, and every year we enact Christmas, and then it's the same. The shepherds, the angels, the wise men, none of it changes. But that doesn't reduce inspiration. It's not repetitive. You don't have to have 8 other different characters instead of these, or different costumes, or change anything to find inspiration in it. But rather, when you're working with the power of Scripture, we actually realize that the more and more and more you go through that same story again, the more you receive from it. The more it becomes deeper in our own consciousness, the more power it has to carry that vibration to all of us. So, with that, we all perhaps know what happened, but I'm going to still share some of the details of the story. So, Jesus was born into this very particular community of Jews called the Essenes. And as it's often told, these are not directly from Bible. This is the historical perspective on what happened during that time. So, to give you a context of what was happening in Israel at this time, so Israel is the land of the Hebrews or the Jews, and they have this religion that they've inherited from Abraham and Moses and all the different prophets. And as we saw last week, the whole religion has now reduced, or the practice of the religion has reduced to a bunch of rules. When I say a bunch of rules, I don't mean 20 or 30, but over 600. And all of what the religion means to people is following all these hundreds of rules as strictly as they can. And then there's a whole orthodox structure built around it. Jerusalem is the center of the Jewish faith. During Passover, which is the time then Moses crossed over from Egypt, he parted the Red Sea. That is considered one of the most significant events. All the events related to Moses coming back to the Promised Land is considered the most sacred for Jews, and it's celebrated every year as Passover. There are also a lot of other observances, many other festivals that they celebrated at that time that's mentioned in the Bible. But during Passover, everybody comes to Jerusalem because it's the center of that religious activity, and everything is set up around there. And at this time, the Roman Empire has political control over the land of Israel. So although the Jews have freedom to practice their religion, they are paying taxes back to the Romans. And the Romans obviously are exploiting the land for its resources, and they're just drawing the wealth out. So there's also a very strong resentment against the Romans. But at the same time, the Romans are your overlord. They are your governors, they are your officials, they are your kings. So you cannot just be open about it. So obviously there's a resentment, excuse me, there's a growing resentment amongst the Jewish people against the Romans. But also in some pockets it might be a revolt, but in other senses people are also just being very careful in how they work with the Romans, because at the end of the day, they are your kings. So this is the setting and into which Jesus is born. And Jesus is born not in the heart of Jerusalem, not within the Orthodox, the Jewish priesthood, or any of the people who retain control of this entire structure, but rather he's born to this couple, Mary and Joseph, who belong to the Essene community, which is also a very religious community, but not as connected with the power structure in Jerusalem. And it reminds one, as I was quoting a few minutes ago, the line from the festival. That light is drawn in the setting where it's most conducive for it to express itself naturally, where the heart's devotion is present. The light does not arrive to overpower the structure and to turn it over, which is what people confuse Jesus' life to be, or confused at that time. Most of those that even recognized Jesus for who he was, they always assumed that this man was going to overthrow or completely redefine the power structure in Israel. Rather, Jesus kept affirming, and he kept trying to explain to them the kingdom I'm talking about is of a very different kind. Again, we looked at it last week with this whole idea of kingdom and promised land. Again, one of the significant contentions between the Jewish faith and the Christian faith, where the promised land in the kingdom in the Jewish interpretation is actually referring to the land of Israel, whereas Jesus makes it very clear he's not talking about that. But I have to also qualify here, because this is where the interpretation brought to us by Yogananda, and this particular teaching is relevant for us, because even the Christian interpretation presents this whole kingdom as the construct of heaven, of something you're going to have after your life is done, and then you'll be happily living there ever after. But as we understand from the yogic point of view, the kingdom he's talking about is a place of inner freedom, is a place of perfection that is not on the outside. I just want to quote a line from the play this morning. I hope I can get it right. For those of you, if you're watching this later, today we had a play on the life of Luther Burbank, who was a botanist, is that what he's called? Who was actually a saint. That's how Yogananda referred to him. I'm not going to go into that. And there was a line from the play which was beautiful. I wish I could remember all of it. I'm assuming these are quotes from Burbank. And he said, "We find meaning in life in the flow of experience that we go through on a day-to-day basis, and not in the promise of heaven afterwards." So it was beautiful, and it speaks to, again, just like the difference between the Jewish and the Christian point of view, also, what we Yogananda call churchianity, or the traditional Christian point of view, and the yogic point of view. Because the promised land, for some people, it just refers to the country of Israel. For others, it's the kingdom of heaven that you inherit if you do all the right things, and then now you have a big palace in heaven where you can live happily through eternity. And for others, we know that it is the state of inner perfection and transcendence that one has to achieve by inward communion with the divine. So, coming back to the story. So he's born and drawn to this Essene community where there is still that heartfelt devotion present, not entirely overpowered by the politics of Jerusalem. And what happens, there's an interesting series of circumstances into which he incarnates, which is that King Herod, who was the Roman emperor ruling all of land at the time when Jesus is born, he orders for a census. And he wants everybody to go back to where they came from or where their families belong. And Joseph, the father of Jesus, or at least the father of Jesus on the birth certificate, because Jesus is God's son, and he belonged to Bethlehem. So now Joseph and Mary have to go to Bethlehem in order to deliver the child. And I didn't mean to skip the part. Also, according to the Bible, or at least the Bible that we have today, this is considered contentious by many. Mary was a virgin. She was already carrying the child when she was marrying Joseph. And this was not a child that was formed by human union. It was a child that came to her through Holy Spirit, through God himself. And that's why Jesus is considered the Son of God. And we'll talk about some of the symbolism later on next week. I'm not going to go into that. But I also just wanted to mention, because I was doing a lot of research today, Yogananda never made any explicit references to that, although it is so central to the Christian faith and how Bible is interpreted. So anyway, moving on. So Joseph and Mary are now traveling back to Bethlehem. Mary is pretty close to delivering, and they realize that they won't be able to reach their home before nightfall, and this is what the story of Christmas is. And they find a stable and just in a manger, a container where hay is kept for animals to feed on. That's where Jesus is ultimately delivered on that particular night. And just by his presence, just by the light he emanated and what he carried, a lot of people were drawn to him. Just the shepherds that were sleeping. There were angels that people were seeing. And then there were these three other interesting people, the wise men who came from the east. And they were following the star of east. Again, we will discuss a lot of this in the symbolism later on next week. But now just talking about the story, they also come to pay their respect to this child because they've been following the star and looking for the Messiah. They knew that this is the Messiah. And some of you may be familiar with this. Yogananda mentioned very casually, apparently, in a conversation with Swamiji, that the three wise men who came to greet Jesus when he was born were none other than the three gurus of this path, Babaji, Lahiri Masha, and Yukteswar Giri. And it goes on later. It's relevant because we also see after 8 years, the story just sort of takes an abrupt pause in Jesus' life. You don't know what happened, and suddenly he's 32 years old. So Yogananda said that those years, a lot of the missing years where Bible does not talk about Jesus, he was actually in India. He went to, as in his own words, he went to pay the visit back to the masters and to train with the Himalayan yogis. And then he also lived and traveled in India before coming back to Israel and to his people in Jerusalem. So the wise men come to pay respect. And the wise men, as they're following the star, they also ask for directions. And they're talking to people, and this news that these wise men are following the birth of this Messiah reaches Herod, who is now concerned. Because a lot of the concern, everybody just how men of the world can be, everybody just has their own narrative of self-concern. whether it's the Pharisees and the Sadducees, the priesthood in Jerusalem, whether it's the Romans who were concerned about their taxes and their kingdom. Everybody just has their priorities. And King Herod is obviously concerned that this might be a cause for instability, if not even a complete takeover or a loss of his kingdom. So he does not like this idea that there is this great Messiah that is incarnated and that he might just completely change what Jewish life is at that time. So Herod orders, he knows at this point that there was a child born in Bethlehem and that some people believe that he is the Messiah and he could bring great good light, hope. He could change the lives of many, many people, and that's not appealing to him. It obviously brings a lot of change that would be displeasing to his kingdom and his way of ruling and his taxes. So he decides to actually kill all the infants that were born in Bethlehem under the age of 2 as soon as he hears this news. So this is actually historically something that happened, a huge carnage, where Herod ordered his people, the warriors, to the military to go to Bethlehem and kill all the infants between the ages of 0 and 2. And obviously, Mary and Joseph were counseled to escape from Israel and go to Egypt during this time. So the first many, many years of Jesus' life were spent in Egypt because to escape the assassination, the persecution by Herod. So Jesus goes away and then he returns at the age of 8. And there's one more story along with the same vein. In the same vein, Jesus also had a cousin. His name was John. And the Bible also talks about John and Jesus and how their incarnations are connected with each other. And again, I don't mean to keep saying this over and over, but we will talk more about it next week because Yogananda had specific mention of John and Jesus as prophets from the Old Testament who had a guru-disciple relationship that they were carrying through in this incarnation. So John was also obviously a very high spiritual soul who incarnated at the same time, and he also is growing up in Nazareth. So Jesus, at the age of 8, returns back to Jerusalem, and then they settle down in Nazareth. And John is also growing up there at the same time. John is just a little bit older than Jesus. I don't know by how many years or how many months, but he's very close to Jesus in age. And when Jesus comes back, he immediately, the first thing, the Bible talks about how Jesus is with Mary and he gets lost in the busy streets. And then after some time, Mary finds him in the synagogue. And while he's there, even at the age of 8, he seems to be already very well versed in the Bible, in the Torah, in the Old Testament at that time. And he's already preaching, sharing, interpreting these verses. And everybody is looking at this 8-year-old boy as a teacher at that time. And obviously, Mary is pretty surprised. Where did you go? I lost you for a moment. And then that's when Jesus says, I have to go about my Father's business. He's not talking about Joseph's business, which was carpentry, but he was referring to God's business for which he incarnated. So we will share one more song now, The Light That Was Christ. This is a song that talks about John the Baptist and his incarnation along with Jesus. Shone in the blindest of hearts, making me that the way to inner peace, to testify that Christ came from above, a messenger of God declared before. Fear not, Zacharias, for your wife, though now old, shall bear a son who knows wisdom's ways. Lo, Zacharias and his wife their wisdom reaped through the years, submitted to the will of God, and became soon Thereafter, the parents of John. So, we have Jesus and John the Baptist. The Baptist is obviously a title. So John is also aware, just through his own intuition and this is the mission with which he incarnated, that his job is to make way for the Messiah. That's how the Bible says. He is coming even before Jesus makes his appearance public. In the Bible, we get this sense almost as we read the story of Jesus through the various Gospels that Jesus is almost being very careful because this is not an ordinary man and he knows what he's going to be up against. So even when he returns back, now I'm moving to the 30s when Jesus is an adult and he has disappeared into India and now he's back. Fast forward in the story. Now, Jesus and John the Baptist are both men in their 30s living in Israel. And as Jesus returns back, now John is making way for the Messiah. At this time, Jesus was away. And through these years, his adult years of John, he himself leads a life of deep meditation and prayer. There are lots of places in the Bible. This is fascinating for me because the Bible talks about how Jesus often wants to be alone and to be in prayer. I don't know what the original Latin or the Aramaic or Greek word was, but I wonder whether it really meant prayer or what the English translation has been over the years, because it sounds like if he always wants to be alone, he wants to do more than prayer. It sounds more like meditation. But anyway, we find it very often, these references in the Bible, in all the four Gospels that relate to the life of Christ, where he's often telling his disciples, I need some alone time, not because he's exhausted or he somehow needs a break, but more because he wants to be engaged in a certain form of inner communion. So it is pretty clear that Jesus is deeply drawn in that way. And we get the sense through the New Testament in many places that Jesus is very careful with how public he wants to be. In fact, in the earlier parts when he starts healing people, there are times when he tells them, again, these are exactly as stated in the gospel, he tells them, do not share it with anybody. Do not let anybody know that I healed you. And then later on, he just said, go tell the world. Tell everybody that you have been healed through the Messiah. And then he makes references to himself as the Son of Man. Again, first he doesn't say anything. He's just this random teacher walking, in Capernaum, in Galilee, and Jerusalem, just gathering disciples and sharing teachings and parables and all of that, just in the most casual way. And then later on, when it becomes clear that he's doing a bigger work, he's not just a nomadic preacher who's gathering people, he starts addressing himself as the Son of Man. And then even later on, when he realizes that he is about to take his mission to the next step, that's when he starts referring to himself as the Son of God. So you see a progression, not in Jesus' own evolution, but rather in how he presents himself. And even in the short time, I don't quite know exactly how many years that the Bible is talking about when Jesus was an adult, but it's not a lot of years, 2-3 years at the most, because by the time Jesus is back, at least where the story is picked up in the Bible, when Jesus is seen in Capernaum and Jesus is back in Israel, and then he starts doing all this, it's not very long before when he's actually crucified. So we have this very short window of this Messiah's life that we get to see, and even in that short frame of time, he's constantly, there's a significant evolution in how he presents himself. So John the Baptist, at this point, he himself has become a spiritual teacher, not in the orthodox way, but he is already talking about the Messiah that is about to come. They have not had the childhood together, John and Jesus, but they obviously know of each other. They intuitively recognize who they are. They have this connection, as I said, that is coming from many, many past lives because both of them were prophets of the past. And John the Baptist has this particular way of baptizing. He dips his disciples in the Jordan River, in a way of embracing and opening themselves up to God. And then he teaches them teachings. And we don't have a lot of references to what John exactly taught in the Bible, but the only reference that we find is that John was always making references to the Messiah when he was sharing with his disciples. So John already has a coterie of disciples by this point when Jesus is arriving. And then Jesus obviously meets John, and in their meeting, Jesus asks John to baptize him just the way he's baptizing his disciples. And then John says, I wouldn't be fit enough even to touch your shoes. How can I baptize you? Because he knew who Jesus was, that he was a pure incarnation of Christ consciousness, and he was feeling a little bit out of place, just being that person who's now supposed to teach or be a teacher to this Messiah. But Jesus says that's the way it's meant to be done, because in a way, John plays the role of Jesus as guru. Guru not in the sense that John had to teach teachings that Jesus needed to learn from him, because Jesus was born with complete realization. He did not need that. But still, Jesus needed to have that doorway of that connection, because that was from the past, from the Old Testament, and through his relationship with John. And that's how we all find God, through that particular doorway. And in the New Testament, John acts as that guru to Jesus, who baptizes him in the Jordan River. And soon after that, Jesus goes through what is called the temptation, where he goes into the desert and he's tempted by Satan. Again, we don't have a lot of details of what exactly happened or what the temptation looked like. There's a lot of imagination in over the many years of people, supposing from our little human understanding of what that might have looked like. But I think it would be just naive of us to even think that we can understand what somebody in that stature would go through when they are being tested by Satan. Who knows? Anyway, so Jesus goes through that phase, and when he comes out of it, he has already done the tapasya. In a way, this is just me guessing or extrapolating at this point. In a way, Jesus was doing a certain tapasya during that time, because when he came out of that, that's when he was actually ready to start teaching and start sharing and begin his mission. And that was possible because he went through those 40 days of that intense period of being tested by Satan and whatever suffering he had to go through during that time. So Jesus comes out, and then now he's walking around just, I think he was even a carpenter for some time. I'm not totally sure about that. Again, Bible just presents a lot of these stories in these 4 Gospels. They cannot be chronologically all tied up neatly. We just make our best guesses to understand what might have happened at that time. But very soon, not too late after that, the disciples start gathering. Some of John's disciples are drawn to Jesus. There's already a group of people that are waiting to hear from Jesus, because as soon as Jesus comes out of his temptation, he comes out of the desert, you see that John constantly starts referring to him. Now John, when he is baptizing people, he's pointing them towards Jesus. You see that John, that's probably what his role was, not just in the story, but incarnationally. He was making way for the Messiah. He was preparing the ground for Jesus to actually come. And just in case you all didn't know, John himself does not live very long. John is more rebellious, let's say, than Jesus is. And he gets into trouble very often, and he's imprisoned by Herod very soon after that, and he's also killed in prison. I don't quite know, or I don't know if the Bible even talks about exactly for what crime. I think there is also just this general understanding that the Romans did not like to deal with too much drama. They just wanted the Jewish people to follow their rules and just be happy in their power structure, and not constantly creating tension or chaos within that structure, which would destabilize the empire for the Romans, because they were dependent on the taxes and the governance of these provinces. So it was not like the Romans had anything against Jesus or John the Baptist. We see this even more obviously when we come to the crucifixion and the later part of Jesus' life. They didn't have anything personal for or against Jesus. In fact, they did not have a truly spiritual religion. They had, I don't know if it's pagan or whatever they inherited, but it was not rooted in individual spirituality. Whatever their relationship to a higher reality was, it really was not grounded in personal spirituality. So they really had nothing for or against any of these belief systems or any of these prophets and messiahs, except that they really cared for law and order. They really did not want any chaos in their kingdom, and they wanted their power structure to be intact within the land of the Jews. So, for some reason that I'm not sure about right now, John, ultimately, not at this point, later on, we also hear from the Bible that John was in fact killed well before Jesus was crucified. Again, by Herod, he was also killed by the Romans. So Jesus, at this point, and the first time Jesus enters Jerusalem, and this is where we start seeing a little bit of what and why Jesus is doing what he's doing, although he's staying a little bit under the covers, but he is not ever pretending to belong to the existing structure. Even the very first time when Jesus comes to Jerusalem for Passover, as soon as he comes back to Israel, the first thing he does, he goes to the temple and he throws all the money changers out. It's a very famous story. For those of you that don't know, so in the temple, you had to pay the priest for different kinds of rituals and ways in which you propitiate God. And for that, you had to use a certain currency, which was the temple currency. And that's different from the currency you actually used in the markets or you used for financial transactions. So there was this whole business of money lending, money exchanging that was happening outside the Jerusalem temple. And these people were making a lot of profit just in currency conversion. And the whole system was created so a lot of these middlemen, including the priests and the various structures holding together the Jerusalem establishment, they could profit from all of these different transactions. So that was the whole purpose of the whole system. And Jesus obviously did not care for it. And in fact, that's putting it very mildly. He obviously was totally against. He came to get rid of these kind of middlemen and ways in which religion was being exploited. So he immediately throws the money changers outside of the temple. And then he rebukes them. And he says, do you know who are you? What gives you the power to do this? How can you just come and do that? And do you know what consequences you will suffer for your actions? And then at this point, Jesus says, maybe many of you are familiar with these passages. He says, if you destroy this temple, I'll rebuild it in 3 days. And then people respond at that time, it took so many years for us to build this temple. And many times in the Bible, Jesus is constantly making references to his own crucifixion and his resurrection. Because, by the time he is back in Israel, he's already started preaching. As I said, it's a very short period that we get into his life of actually seeing what he did as part of his mission. So he knows what is about to come. He is very clearly aware of what all is going to happen. And this whole reference to 3 days is all over the New Testament in many, many places. And you can easily see, Jesus was talking about something and the people were interpreting something else. They thought he was talking about the temple in Jerusalem, whereas Jesus was talking about the temple, the bodily temple. You destroy this temple, because he was telling them, you have no power over me. I can do whatever I'm feeling guided to do, because if you destroy this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days, meaning to say, I will resurrect it. Whereas obviously all they could make sense of it was that he was talking about the physical temple. But he keeps making references to these 3 days. Again, there's a lot of scholarly contentions around this. I was hesitant to Google all these questions, but I needed to just for my own understanding before this class, because the most logical question that one asks is, Good Friday is on a Friday, and then Easter Sunday is on a Sunday. There are only 2 days in between, and Jesus is constantly talking about 3 days. So there are a lot of theories around it, which we are not going to go into. Let's just say the 3 days we are just talking about is the 3 days, not necessarily 3 days and 3 nights, or however time is calculated, or maybe it was approximate. So the first time Jesus enters Jerusalem, he's already resisting the structure. That's why he knows that his role is to completely overturn, is to completely, create a new reality for people's relationship with God and how they're going to practice their religion. And it's not going to be accepted or not going to be received by any of the existing priesthood. So he's being careful, but at the same time, he's being pretty straightforward from day one. Then he pulls back. He first starts gathering his disciples. The first few, Andrew, Philip, and then Simon, James, John. So these are all the first few disciples that Jesus starts to gather. Again, for those of you who are hearing these stories for the first time, if you're not familiar, there are many disciples that Jesus gathers and who are constantly traveling with him, who are preaching with him. And there are 12 that he calls apostles, especially after this resurrection. Also, he comes back and nominates them in a particular way as his representatives. And even while he is in his body, he allows them to preach, to heal, to carry the message on his behalf. So there are a lot of disciples that are tuning into and receiving from Jesus. And also there are these 12 particular disciples that he nominates as his successors in a certain way. And one of them is Judas, who obviously ends up betraying him. We'll come to that later. But so he starts gathering all these disciples. Simon, who is who later gets the name Peter. He's fishing and he's trying to repay the debt, and he's trying to make his living by fishing, and he's caught in some trouble, and Jesus immediately helps him. If Jesus does miracles, basically. He throws the net, and at an odd time, they keep gathering huge boatloads of fish, and they immediately recognize that Jesus is not an ordinary man. And they also get the word. Some of these people, they've already heard from John the Baptist that this is the Messiah. This is the one you're supposed to follow. So Jesus is walking on that guidance and pointer already given by John, and now he's able to give signs to his disciples in order to get them on his side. So Jesus starts gathering his disciples, and slowly he starts performing these miracles. There's a very interesting character which the Bible does not talk a lot about, but there's this one person called Nicodemus, who's also mentioned around the same time, who was actually a Pharisee. And Nicodemus is able to see, he's part of what's called the Sanhedrin, which is the high Jewish council of priests at Jerusalem. So he's a high-profile Jewish official priest, considered a scholar. And Nicodemus recognizes who Jesus is. And Jesus calls him, and Jesus even tells him that, I think you understand who I am. And Jesus has a particular connection with Nicodemus. However, Nicodemus is still struck between the establishment, his life, and overthrowing all of that, and this choice of either following Jesus or not. There's not a lot mentioned about Nicodemus, except that the Bible says Jesus considered Nicodemus also one of the ones he chose. So he could have been the 13th apostle or one of the apostles in a certain way, but he just couldn't break away from his own past and the structure that he felt bound by, and so he couldn't. But later on, we realize, even during crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, Nicodemus is still there. The character recurs once or twice in the New Testament, where you see that he never turns against Jesus, although he's one of the Pharisees who is associated with the main power structure in Jerusalem. So slowly, Jesus starts performing one miracle after another, and the famous story of the wedding. He goes to a wedding, and then they run out of wine, and then he asks the people there to bring a lot of water, fill big cauldrons, and then he converts the water into wine. A lot of these stories, they start spreading, just word of mouth, from one person to another. It does not create big ripples in Jerusalem yet, because at this point, the Jewish society also has all these hierarchies. There are the Romans, who are the governors, who are the kings, the militia, the police, and all the officials, the tax collectors, all of them, they have already been imposed on the Jewish land, on the culture, and they're watching over. And then there is the priesthood, and there's a whole power structure on how much control and influence they have over society. And then there's all the other people, the fishermen and the farmers and all the lay people who do not actually have any close connection or access either to the priesthood and the formal religious institution in Jerusalem. And of course, the Romans are far, far above and beyond that. They have no connections or say or any relationship with any of this. So I don't know how many thousands of people lived at that time, but you can already see there's many, many hierarchies of how things happened. So when Jesus is preaching and he's talking to people and he's performing all these miracles at this time, it's a grassroots movement. It's not happening anywhere in these hierarchies or structures, but rather with the people of the land, with people that are just involved in their normal life. Even the apostles, there are all kinds of apostles. I think, what's his name? There's one of them who is considered a passionate, almost somebody who's militant by nature, who is about to fight Romans. He gets converted by Jesus. And Matthew, who wrote one of the Gospels, he's a tax collector. And I think during culturally and historically, the tax collectors at that time were almost at par with prostitutes or other really, really people that were really looked down upon. Because the Jewish people were not, they were not capable, or they didn't have the ability to actually fight the Romans. So they were not in active rebellion, but the resentment was very, very deep. Because they felt like they already had a true religion that came through their prophets, and they were practicing, and they were given this land by Moses and Abraham and their ancestors, and now they're being governed by these people who have no religion, no faith, who are completely driven by material desires. And so there's a lot of resentment amongst the Jewish people against the Romans. And so tax collectors are actually people who belong to the Jewish faith but are employed by the Romans. So it's considered the highest form of betrayal at that time. So Matthew, who again becomes one of the disciples of Jesus and ends up becoming one of the apostles, is actually a tax collector who's looked down upon by everybody, by his own family, by other Jews in Israel. So maybe we'll do a song. Shall we do fewer so many, or whichever you feel. Can you do it yourself? Mm-hmm. We'll share one more song from the oratorio. We are not, obviously, this is a very short summary version of the whole life of Christ. If we had more time, as Asha will do the day before Easter, if there's a song for everything I'm describing, we will just share one of the songs where his mission starts to grow.
Yeah, this is called The Few Were Soon Many, where he's gathered their disciples in kind of the intimate times where he was just spending time with those close disciples of his. The few were soon many, great multitudes came, drawn by the magnet of love. The brinkmen mistook, for the banks of a stream was revealed an ocean's broad shore. Christ's Spirit embraced saints and sinners alike, and his words were sweet music, people's faith did restore.
As this, as the mission gets more and more traction, you can understand Jesus tries to stay away from Jerusalem for a long time. He is very careful with how public he is with his work. So he starts to spend more time in the region of Galilee. He's still very nomadic. He's traveling. They never had a particular place where they stayed for a long time. In Capernaum and Bethany, they're constantly traveling. And obviously, everywhere he goes, he's touching people's lives, he's healing, he's performing miracles, but he's also constantly in movement. And in a way, these are all just the ways in which we might put pieces together, not exactly presented by the Bible in the same way. But you can also see there's this connection and camaraderie forming between disciples where there is a better setting for Jesus to actually preach and share that vibration with the small group of people, or big. We don't know how many exactly traveled with him. These are all just things we can guess. The Bible does not talk about it in great level of detail, but we can imagine how he needed to step away from the cities, from being set in one place. He needed to just define the aura himself around where he was in order to help his disciples, in order to prepare them for what was about to come. So he's constantly moving from one place to another. There's just so many stories that the Bible talks about, all the different kinds of healings. He obviously heals the blind, he heals a leper, he's, what is it called? When they're possessed by evil spirits, he chases the spirits out of their body. There's a lot of these healings at different points that many Gospels talk about, many, many instances. One can only imagine again the way it is being said in the Gospels. It's not the entirety of all that happened. Wherever he was going, he was just constantly healing people. And in a sense, healing is a way one serves. But if we tune into, not when I say one serve, not all of us are not capable of healing in that way. He was serving those people by healing. But I think even more importantly, or in a deeper sense, he was performing these miracles to open people's eyes because he knew his time was limited. He wanted them to have a real experience of something that was so transcendental, so they would have that faith on which they could practice their own religion and have their connection with the Christ. Because without that healing, without that miracle, you can only see yourself in these settings. Oh, I heard that this might be the Messiah. Is he really? What does he look like? It's just you can see yourself as somebody who's just a normal person, living in Capernaum or Jerusalem at that time. You hear all kinds of accounts. How do you know what is true? But then, when you have an experience that touches you, when you have an experience where somebody just makes a mockery of physical laws or just the limitations of the physical plane, immediately our own faith is able to, we can build that on top of that experience. And in a sense, I personally tend to think that that was part of what Jesus was doing through all these missions. He was building people's faith for them to be able to see who he was, because without that, he would just be another prophet. He would just be another Messiah. They might listen to him today, they'll listen to somebody else tomorrow. They wouldn't get the gravity of what he was trying to bring. There are a couple of different stories that, there's one that obviously there's a song in the oratorio. I want to share that, so I'll perhaps just share that one. He goes through this land called Samaria. The Samaritans are people that are not Jews. So there's a lot of different ethnic, racial groups around this time. The Samaritans and the Jews, they actually are in a way related to the old prophets. So they are not what the Jews call Gentiles. The Gentiles are people who have no relationship with the Torah or the prophets of the Old Testament. So like the Greeks and the Romans, they're all in a way Gentiles. They're just completely outside of the Jewish faith. The Samaritans are worse because they have some relationship, so they're active enemies with perhaps different systems of belief or whatever disagreement that they had. We don't get into those details in the Bible. We don't see that. But Jesus goes to Samaria, and there's this well that is associated with one of the Old Testament prophets. So it's not even accidental that he goes to this well, which had a very special religious significance for the Jews. And then there's a woman drawing water from that well. This woman has been unfaithful in many of her relationships. For many reasons, she had a bad relationship or whatever. And she is also hurting. She's hurting deeply because of the stigma that she faces because of having been through whatever experiences that she has been through. And then Jesus meets her by the well. And he asks for water, and then maybe some of you know the story, and for those of you that don't, immediately the woman says, you look like a Jew. Why do you want, the Jews wouldn't touch, they wouldn't want water from the Samaritans, and also you don't know who I am. I'm really, really looked down upon because I don't have one husband. I've been with many men, and I have led a life that has really ostracized me from the society. You don't want this. And then Jesus says, who are you? Who are you? And then she says, she does not share the entirety of all of her life. And then Jesus immediately is able to reveal to her all of her own past of what really happened, why it happened. And she recognizes who this man is. And then Jesus, we'll sing the song, and then we'll move on from there. The song is Living Water. sing along.
I think this key will work.
You can take this lower than the choir. Anything, sir. He who would slake his thirst now and forever, let him not fill his cup here from this well, from living water, sipped in the silence, in spirit and in truth, break ego's spell. Though fallen deep in sin, by men abandoned, if longing for His grace, truth be your guide, He can redeem you from every evil. Friend, only think of Him, walk by His side. This whole idea of redemption and healing, I've been using the word a lot, but that's really not what he was offering, because that does not really, that barely touches upon what a Messiah offers. What he was offering really was redemption. And redemption just is a way to open ourselves to receive that grace that is not limited by any of our past. It's not limited by whatever we identify with, whatever we are bound by, whatever we think we are limited by. And every time Jesus was going through this journey of traveling from one city to another, healing this person or that person, he was offering them a taste of what this grace can do, but really what he was offering was redemption. Redemption is just that connection with God, that promise of perfection, no matter where you are at or who you are, that perfection can be yours, and that transcendence and that connection with the divine is not subjected to anything that you think is standing between you and God, but rather the birthright that all of us were born with. So that was a beautiful song that I really enjoy every time it comes in the oratorio. You know, there's just so many more instances of how Jesus does all of this. I'm going to just skip over a lot of my notes here of the different healings that he performs. There are certain few instances, and this is the time, as you can see, in a way, again, these are things that one surmises. It's not actually exactly clear chronologically how these things are happening in the Bible, but one gets the sense that, you know, almost like you're pressing on the gas pedal and gradually increasing the speed from 10 miles to 80 miles per hour. That's the sense one gets, because gradually the way Jesus heals, the way he talks about it, the way he touches people, what really happens, the number of people that come to him, it's gradually swelling. Just, I don't know, maybe in weeks, months, however long it is as he's traveling through these places. And then everything becomes very conscious and calculated, because there's an establishment that is waiting there, and there are Romans. None of them are going to receive all of this with open arms. So there is a power structure that is going to contest and try to squash all of what Jesus is bringing. So there has to be a lot of caution and strategy with which he has to approach and go about his mission. So one gets the sense very clearly because he's always in movement and he's going to all these places. And also, you also get the sense, just the way Jesus travels and all these stories that are described in the Bible, one hears of Anandamoyi Ma sometimes. And you hear stories of just how she would just go to a place and then you don't know whether she's going to be there for 2 days or 2 years. There's this beautiful ashram in India. It's in a place called Vindhyachal. It's a very small rural town, about a few hours from Varanasi. And I was in the ashram not too long ago, and it's a very sacred ancient town referred to in the scriptures. But as there's an ashram for Ma in the small rural town. I'm digressing from Jesus' story, but I thought it's relevant in terms of how we tune in and understand how these masters really work. And as I was reading about the ashram and the stories of Ma in that place, what was very obvious is that Ma just started walking when she was in Varanasi, and then she walked to that place. And nobody really knew that she was actually going to establish a work in this rural town. She just walked there, and then she just sat there. And then now they had to figure everything else out because people started coming. They had to put structures around her, and then they had to start cooking for people. And then they had to start building an ashram. It all just happened. But it's not like she sat down and told them, I'm wondering if we should establish an ashram in this town that's 4 hours from here. She was just constantly feeling that inner call for what God was asking her to do, and then she was always moving. She was always listening, and she was always moving. And again, these are all things that I'm extrapolating or just guessing based on what the Bible says. But you see, there's a non-linearity. In fact, I was looking at all these maps that so much research has been done in the Bible, with the Bible and all of this, just like all these points in Israel, and like some of them are places that we know for sure Jesus did this, some of these are people's best guess on where this might have happened, and then he went here, and then they put numbers on it. This one map that I was looking at where they rebuild the chronology of how all the different stories might have happened, again, because one is trying to scholastically put these pieces together. And then so incident 1, incident 2, there's like 40 different bullet points in this list, and then they put all these numbers. But then I was looking at this map. It's not like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, like 1, 2, 3, 4. It's just like all over. What was he doing? There is no linearity in how he was approaching, but of course, one can only feel that he was truly listening and he was being guided in a particular way, whether it was going to Samaria, going to that well, stopping there. The disciples wonder, why is he doing that? But he knew that he needed to redeem this woman who would come to the well at that time. And all of these different things, just for this one disciple here, this one disciple there, he was just constantly feeling that call and constantly moving through the land as he was going through. At this point, he also makes it very clear that his mission, all of the Jews assume, he's called the rabbi. He's seen as one of those prophets or teachers, just like the ones from Old Testament. So people just assume, we need to be paying attention to you because you're important for all the Jews. But then he also makes it pretty clear at one point, no, I didn't come for the Jews. I came for everybody. I want to go see the Gentiles. I want to go see the Samaritans. I'm not limited by whatever you think I'm supposed to do. And then he does that too. He goes to Decapolis and all these different places. He travels, the Sea of Galilee. It's not a sea as far as I understand. I've not been to Israel. It's just a big lake. And he even travels, to these different places, even to preach to Gentiles, which again is quite surprising. It just, for people that are so bound just by the material form, it just boggles their mind, especially the structure in Jerusalem. They just cannot understand. What is he up to? Why is he doing this? Why would he be interested? The Gentiles are almost like untouchables. They're just really, really looked down upon by the people in Jerusalem. I think at that time I don't even think the Gentiles could enter Jerusalem. There was just or the temple. There were a lot of laws around how the Gentiles were inferior to the Jewish people. And then obviously Jesus did not care about any of those rules. And the other part of it, which is almost just at the core of the Jewish faith, is all these rules around Passover, Sabbath, and the different things one could and couldn't do, he started blatantly disobeying them also. There are multiple times where he deliberately heals people on the Sabbath day, and then he does not disapprove his disciples when they do other things on Sabbath day that are prohibited by the scriptures. And then, that's when he starts referring to himself as a son of man. These words, again, I sometimes just wonder, what did the original Greek or Aramaic really said? You just say son of man doesn't really mean much. Just the literal word. He starts referring to himself when he starts to claim that authority, when he starts to tell his disciples, it doesn't matter, I am a prophet, but I was sent by God. I'm not bound by all the different rules that everybody else has set for you. Everybody has convinced that this is religion. I'm not bound by that. I get to tell, I get to decide, I get to share what God's command is because I have that authority myself. That's when he says, the Son of Man is the Lord of the Sabbath. There's a famous line from the autobiography which Yukeshwar and Master quotes in the autobiography of Yogi, where he says, Sabbath was made for the man and not man for the Sabbath, which is to say, again, that's a direct quote from the Bible. These rules, he was talking about the one Sabbath day where you're not supposed to do this and that and all these rules around it. But in essence, he was referring to all those 600 plus rules. All these rules were made in order for us to find and deepen our connection with God. They were made for us. We were not made for them. That was, again, the fundamental structure of how the Jewish faith worked at that time, perhaps even somewhat to this day, because that's what defines that faith as a religion. That they take a lot of care in making sure these rules are followed. And then he says the Son of Man is the Lord of Sabbath. These words that he's referring to, they're actually phrases used by the Old Testament prophets. So a large part of how Jesus preaches and how he claims authority is also somebody who's fulfilling the prophecy, who is not just an authority coming by himself. It is almost a very interesting idea to think about, especially for those of us here in the US, because the West itself has a particular quality to it, but the US especially is so particularly individualistic that this whole idea of scriptural authority or any authority is often not considered important, let alone valued or respected in that same way. In the Yoga Sutras of Patanjali, they're very concise and very brief, and Patanjali at one point says, how do you know what is true teaching or not? Patanjali just simply says, does it agree with the scriptures and what the scriptures state? And then that is one of the ways in which whether a teaching is referring to scriptural authority is one of the ways in which you know whether it's true or not just you're a teacher now has started teaching and you can declare your own truths and you're channeling directly from God and you get to say, that you have not 7 but 9 chakras or, whatever people can come up with. That's not what Jesus was doing. He was a messenger from God, but also he was constantly deferring. He was constantly talking. These words, Son of Man and Son of God, are all actual quotes that he draws from the Old Testament. And interestingly, that's what really, really, really triggers the priesthood. Because if he said something else, they would probably let it pass. But now he's quoting their own scriptures and saying, I am the fulfillment of what the Old Testament presented. So now they either had to, they could not ignore him. They either had to agree or disagree with him. Either they needed to accept his authority and to see him as the Messiah who has come to guide people to God, or they needed to contest and put him down. So there was no way to ignore, because he was using the authority of the Torah. He was using the authority of the scriptures that they considered absolute. So, the Son of Man is again a phrase from Moses directly. Again, Son of God and all these other phrases that he uses are all from the Old Testament, drawing upon it. And he says, the Lord of the Sabbath. He is the one who makes the rules. The one who's a prophet, the one who is in tune with the divine, makes the rules. That's what your scriptures say. The rules are not made for the prophets. The prophets are the one who get to define the rules. So obviously at this point, it starts building gradually. I'm going to fast forward a little bit because I want to finish by 8:30. So there are a few different things that happen. There are 2 miracles that I'll just briefly mention before moving on to the crucifixion and the end of Jesus' lives. The first one is, at this point when Jesus, again, it's hard for us to say how much time is passing. I'm talking about, what I'm sharing right now could be a few months or a couple of years. You just don't get that sense clearly from the Bible. But it's just some passage of time, and gradually thousands and thousands are drawn to Jesus. And in this one gathering where thousands are drawn, again, this is a story that many of you may have heard, or if you have not, it's a very important story in Jesus' life where there's no food to feed, and everybody is so magnetized to Jesus and his teaching, and they're listening to him teach these parables. And there's only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fishes, and he multiplies that food to enormous quantities in order to feed, I think the Bible says, 5,000 people. So that is, again, these are instances that are quoted in multiple Gospels, because when he's doing that in front of 5,000 people, he's making a statement, and he's now starting to become more and more public. And he also walks on water. The disciples are crossing over the Sea of Galilee in a boat, and then they're stuck in a storm. And then he just appears in the middle of the sea, just walking on water. And there's one account even that says Peter is able to walk on water because of Jesus' grace at that time. So these are things that he now makes it more and more clear. Around the same time, there's also what's called the Sermon of the Mount. This is when Jesus is now expanding his reach. He's not just healing and touching people on this one-on-one basis, but now he's drawing thousands and thousands of followers and directly preaching as a prophet. He's claiming his own position and authority. And the Sermon of the Mount, he chooses a mount so that he can stand on a high ground and talk to hundreds or thousands of people. He shares a lot of the core teachings. He shares a lot of what we consider beatitudes and many other parables and teachings that are shared in that particular instance. And we have time to sing the beatitudes. I think we'll skip. Obviously, this is taking more time. I'm trying to now recalibrate to see how much time we have. So at this point, we have reached the stage where Jesus has become more and more public. There's one more story. I'll mention that too. This, I think, happened around the same time. He also returns to Nazareth because Mary and Joseph were still living. Joseph, I'm not sure. Mary is still living. Mary is seen in Bible a lot. Mary is there even during Jesus' crucifixion. He goes back to Nazareth. And there are many instances quoted in the Bible. There are many places where he is received and people are able to see who he is. There are also instances where that loyalty to the orthodoxy really makes the resistance so stiff that people already start attacking him. When he goes back to Nazareth and tries to preach in that synagogue, they try to arrest him and throw him off a cliff. And again, Jesus escapes that, and then he does not go back to Nazareth after that. And then there are also other places where his teachings are not received, and Jesus simply makes reference to the Bible. Don't worry about it, let's move on. Because just to make that clear, because there are also places where he's already starting to be contested. And anyway, moving to the end of Jesus' life, since we have 10 more minutes before we finish, is where we come to the crucifixion. Now, all of this has happened. He has ruffled enough feathers. The Sabbath healing plays a very critical role in really, really triggering the Orthodox priesthood. And you can only, it's pretty obvious, at least, or at least one is, one assumes that he was deliberately doing, he does even a Sabbath healing in Jerusalem, right in the middle of where all the priesthood is. And then he also goes into Jerusalem and preaches in the temple in a different instance during a different festival. So there is some point in there where Jesus just feels like, I'm done, I'm going to go face it, up front. I'm going to just hit it head on and then deal with it. So obviously then the priesthood, it is taken to this high council of priests. Caiaphas is the highest priest in Jerusalem, the highest Jewish priest, and the Sanhedrin is the council of priests. All of them, they discuss Jesus, and then there's obviously a big lobby that is trying to take Jesus down, that wants to make sure that this person does not create an alternate religion and undermining their authority over the Jewish people. And now there is, for lack of a better word, an arrest warrant. But the important thing to understand here, which is just part of the story, is the Jewish people although they claim a lot of religious authority, they don't have any political or law enforcement authority, because all of that is with the Romans. But they wish they had. So they want to act as if they are the most superior and they have rights to question, to pass judgments, or do things with Jesus. But also they are under the Roman law and the Roman rule. So the Caiaphas orders for Jesus to be brought. Of course, he does not for questioning with the Jewish council. So this is before he's even taken to the Pontius Pilate, that's the Roman governor who ultimately passes the verdict to crucify Jesus. So Jesus is brought for questioning with the Caiaphas. There are a lot of interesting lines. If you have not read those sections of the Bible, I would actually encourage you. I'm not going to go through that right now. We want to share some music before we finish. But I encourage you to also read those parts because they're actually very inspiring. You see how Jesus stands up without, while being completely truthful, and also strong in himself without needing to diminish or argue or fight any of these authoritarian figures that are in front of him. Because in the strangest sense, he came for these people. He didn't come to fight these people. He came to redeem these people. So even in his conversations, when he goes to the Pilate and then he says, if you're saying who you are, he says, if my Father wished, he could send a legion of angels and rescue me right now. All the things that he says. But before this point, again, we are fast forwarding the story a little bit here. He has the Last Supper. He clearly knows what is happening. Judas, one of the apostles, he decides to betray Jesus, and he informs the Caiaphas. He works with the Jewish priesthood, and he brings their attendants to arrest Jesus from this garden. And then when he's arrested, he's first questioned by the Caiaphas and the Jewish priestly council. And at that time, it's very interesting to just even watch those, to watch the line of questioning and how Jesus answers. I'm going to digress just a little bit. I was wondering if I should say this or not, but I was thinking about it a lot today as I was reading, and I think it's worth sharing. For most of us here in this room, we all know the lawsuit that Ananda was plagued by, and that was a lot of personal attack on Swami Kriyananda, and there were many, many things that happened during that time. There were a lot of court hearings. When I came to Ananda, when I was trying to figure all of this out, because I was actually part of SRF before I found Ananda, and I was already practicing these teachings. I was a disciple of Yogananda well before I heard about Swamiji, and I came here. When you read, so when I was trying to figure out, there's obviously all this enormous wealth of information on the internet from all sides and all points of views, and it was just so overwhelming and confusing. And I remember reading the actual court transcripts because I said to myself, I'm not going to read all these opinions on the internet. I'm only going to read the court transcripts. And today, as I was reading those sections of the Bible, I almost had a similar feeling where one can stand up for the truth, but without anger, without resistance, without any need to self-defend or argue. And that's what you see. Perhaps it is just an analogy that I feel or something that rings true to me. It may or may not to others who are watching this. But certainly you feel that very strongly when you read those sections of the Bible. So instead of talking about it, I'll just encourage all of you to read it. Even on Wikipedia, you can find all of this. Where Jesus is being questioned, and he's sharing the truth with strength, with complete centeredness, but he's not interested in arguing, fighting, self-defending, self-protecting, because he could say things. He could even state the truth in a particular way and sway Pilate from stopping the crucifixion. He could just tell the Pilate, why are you being a puppet in the hands of the Caiaphas? Aren't you the ruler? They're being crazy. They just think I should be crucified. Even if I'm disobeying the law, I have not harmed anybody. I have not done anything to damage property or anybody's wealth. How could this kind of a punishment be justified? This is unfair on all levels. He could just say he could state very simple arguments that could be presented in front of that could be presented in front of the Roman governor to stop the crucifixion. But you just see and I say see, you just feel it when you read those sections of the Bible. You just feel that there's no self-defense or self-protection. He's truly, truly tuning into what God wants right in that moment. Thy will, not mine, be done. He's really trying to simply act on behalf of God and try to do whatever is being asked of him without any concern for his own ego. At the end of all of this, the governor himself he can feel Jesus' power. He can feel who this man is. And then, I didn't know this for a long time. When you go to Goodwill or other places and you find these crosses, there's this 4 letters written on top of these, I-N-R-I. I don't know if you all have seen or if you know what that means. It's a Latin word. It just means King of the Jews. And so the crime is written on the cross before he's crucified. And then when the governor orders him to be crucified in that particular way with that cross, all the Roman priests protest, saying, why are you saying that? You should say he said he was the king of the Jews. You were saying he's the king of the Jews. It defeats the whole point of why you're crucifying him, if that's what you want to say on the cross. And then the Pilate just says, I said what I said, and then he moves on. Because he himself knows, it's very clear from the Bible, the Roman governor himself understands this is just a political play. These priests are trying to protect their authority and their power. This man, God knows, maybe he's the Messiah, maybe he's not, but he's certainly not, he's just being played on by this priesthood. He's not committed a crime that is severe enough. It's one thing after another. Even a thief is released, and Jesus is, they get to pardon one person who is about to be crucified that day. And somebody who has performed a much severe crime is actually released in place of Jesus, because the priesthood is really watching to make sure that Jesus is wiped off from existence. So, of course, finally, as we all know the story, I'm sorry to be fast-forwarding. I do want to finish on time. But Jesus is ultimately crucified, and 3 days from then, he resurrects. Let's finish with one song, and then maybe 2 songs. I'll perhaps talk about these sections a little bit more next week when we come back, because I feel bad for rushing through it. I'm just going to play it once through, and then we'll sing it with the guitar. You remain, yeah. I'm going to play the melody of a song that is very familiar to us, and which we sing every Sunday. This is the song that Swamiji actually wrote for the section of crucifixion in Jesus' life as part of the oratorio. And then, I think most of you know the words also. We'll sing it together. First I'll play it, and then we'll sing the words. our emptiness it proved. Now at last our hearts we give you, who remain our friend. Long we fear to face your love, lest our emptiness it prove. Now at last our hearts we give you, who remain our friend. Who remain our friend. We'll share one last song before we close for the evening. This is not one of Swami's pieces, but it is a song that speaks for the experience that Mary Magdalene had when she visited the tomb on the day of Easter morning. And she realizes that the tombstone is moved and the body is no longer there. And she finds herself walking with Jesus. She's the first one to witness the resurrection of Jesus. So this song is written from her point of view. I come to the garden alone, while the dew is still on the roses, and the voice I hear falling on my ear, the Son of God discloses, and He walks with me, and He talks with me, and He tells me I am His own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever known. He speaks, and the sound of His voice, so sweet the birds hush their singing, and the melody that He gave to me within my heart is ringing. And He walks with me, and He talks with me, and He tells me I am His own, and the joy we share as we tarry there, none other has ever